When Joscha was visiting our lab, we had two, among many other things, we had two interesting points that we talked about that I thought, Chris could talk about as well. Which one was about error correcting codes. So maybe we can start with that, and then the other one had to do with protocognitive capacities at the bottom of the scale, particles and things like that. So I don't know. Maybe we start with the error correcting codes. You guys want to talk about error correction and how you see it? Maybe Joscha, do you want to go first and just summarize what you were saying?
Yes. So very briefly put, the reason why there's something rather than nothing is probably because the universe is not impossible. So if you're in base reality, nothing precedes the universe to make it not happen. It's going to have an existing in the non-existing branch. In the non-existing branch, you don't get observers that complain. So you basically have existence for free. Now we need to figure out why some things are happening in the existing branch and others are not happening. And the easiest answer to that is that simply everything is happening because there's nothing preceding the universe to select operators. So basically, the universe is the superposition of all operators, which means it's a multi-base system. And you yourself being computed by it don't know which path you are. So the universe for you is going to have the appearance of being indeterministic, which means that if you zoom in at the lowest level near the vacuum, you'll see lots of random fluctuations that usually don't amount to anything. In order to build structure, one part of the universe needs to do what another part of the universe is doing. So sometimes you get these circumstances where you have a pattern that remains stable, statistically stable. You will not be able to figure out whether you are in the path where the universe is going to, where the photon is going to the right or left slot, but you know what a million photons are going to look like. In the same way, you don't know which operator is going to happen next, but you know what the superposition of operators is going to look like when you have enough of them and in a certain starting state. And sometimes basically you get a situation where the universe is going to perform error correction. A good metaphor, I think, is you sit in a bathtub, you move your hand, you see on the surface of the bathtub lots of patterns emerging, lots of waves, most of which are just dissipating, not amounting to anything. But sometimes you get a particle, which means a vortex. And the vortex has this property that it's basically circular, so it's shoving the information around in the same volume of space and doesn't dissipate until friction makes it disappear or until it bumps into something. It's not that the water in the bathtub wants to produce those vortices more than other things, it's just what's left over. And I suspect that the same thing is true for all the particles, that basically they are error correcting codes. And the simplest one are control systems that act in the present on the present state or just the immediate state after that. And slightly more complex control systems have a certain degree of elasticity, like molecules, you can squish them and they bounce back into shape. And cells are controllers for future states, they're agents. They basically make models of future paths so you can remain stable over much more complicated circumstances. And in this way, you could say that life itself is an error correcting code that allows to keep particle configurations stable that otherwise wouldn't, and control regions of the universe that wouldn't. And it, of course, it doesn't stop at the level of cells, but also there are systems above the levels of cells, like organisms, societies, and so on, where you find the replication of those control principles.
What? That all sounds good to me.
Good. Next.
That's it.
Thank you for being so patient.
Wow.
So the conclusion from that train of thought is that one way of thinking about mental representations is to look at them from the perspective of error correction, to look at them as quasi-particles. Right? The difference between heat and sound is not that one is not bouncing molecules and the other is not. They both are, but sound is information preserving. It's even quantized. If you look at phonons, it's a quasi-particle that is emergent over the activity of the molecules. It's what's left over after you dissipate the heat in some sense. In the same way, if our brain is, we can see it maybe as an ether, where the individual neurons are nodes that are passing on signals from neighboring nodes in the topology. And then if that thing is stable, information preserving, so you can compute with it, it's basically representations, activation waves are something like quasi-particles moving through this thing.
Yeah. So, yeah, are you familiar with Friston's work on free energy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I guess I interpret I see the free energy principle in its simplest form as saying something much along these lines, that any system that persists, that remains stable, has to do something or other to keep its boundary intact. So it has to effectively be autopoietic. It has to maintain some level of structure.
Yes, but not its
So
boundary in
whatever
space,
the system
boundary in
looks
time.
like, pardon me?
It needs to keep its boundary in time intact, not in space, right? It needs to write itself into the future, but it can be something that is actively colonizing as long as nothing invades it.
Yeah, it has to write some bounded set of values of some bounded set of degrees of freedom into the
Yes.
future.
But for instance, life doesn't need to keep its boundary intact in the sense that it needs to be worried about being invaded by nothingness. It's because it can just itself invade chaos, but it needs to keep its boundary in time intact. Basically, its frontier by which it writes itself into the future needs to preserve it.
Okay, yeah. By boundary, I mean state space boundary.
Ah, yes.
So yeah, put everything in a Hilbert space or something.
Mhm.
That's the boundary that's of interest.
Yeah.
In the free energy principle. So one, I think, can translate what you just said into free energy principle terms without too much trouble. It's certainly consistent with what the free energy principle says. Although the FEP community doesn't seem to talk about error correcting codes very much. They talk about persistent structure instead. But since they fundamentally think of systems as informational structures, maintaining a consistent structure, if you're an informational structure, just is being an error correcting code.
Mm-hmm.
So I think that hangs together quite nicely. I guess another reflection, I think, off of what you just said is the Zurich's quantum Darwinist picture, which you probably are familiar with also, in which state components of some system are being selected by its environment for stability. And again, it's a very boundary preservation sort of idea. If you fix the boundary between the system and its environment, then you fix the interaction at that boundary. And given an interaction for the whole system. And then the stability of that interaction is effectively has to be preserved by the system and its environment working together. And in that case, the eigenvalues of the interaction are essentially being preserved by an error correcting code. The code space being the internal dynamics of both the system and its environment. And I guess the third kind of perspective on that is sort of the more general perspective of error correcting codes that's operable in things like ADS CFT, where the state of some volume is coupled to the state of its surface. So again, a question of although there in that community they don't talk explicitly about observation, they take that for granted. So there is something or other going on in the surface that's describable by some theory.
Oh, I suspect that the ADS CFT conformance is a bit of a red herring. I think that the universe fundamentally is automata, right? So it is not a volume or not a surface because it's not geometry. Geometry is only what happens when you squint at automata at scale.
Yeah. No,
And so,
okay.
of course, you need to have some kind of conformance like this if you have a field description of the universe and the graph description, and you need to map between them. Right, space-time is basically a set of locations that we can make out and the trajectories that information can take between them. And that puts some constraints on what spaces you can observe if they give rise to systems like you within them.
Yeah, terrific. Yeah, I completely agree about space-time being emergent. In fact, Mike and I have been talking for some time about
theory is I don't really know what it exactly describes. If you look at the LLM, that seems to be a radically Fristonian machine in that it's trying to minimize the prediction error. And you could say that it's there is free energy minimization going on at some level. I suspect that for organisms, it's happening in the limit, like for all life on Earth or something like that. But individual organisms look for more concrete things because they are occupying only a small region in the space of behaviors. Right? In some sense, humanity is not an independent species. It's more an organ in the entire dance of the cell on Earth. And our particular role in this organ is just to burn the oil, apparently.
No, our role is to really provide walking apartment houses for bacteria.
Well, that's true for all large organisms. But I think we are the only organism that is able to basically collect this particular entropy, the accidentally fossilized biocarbon that was turned into trees before there were enough insects to take the trees apart. And so our role is to basically put it back into a circulation so Gaia can make new organisms. And I don't know whether Gaia already planned for us to wake up the rocks. I think if that happens, there is the next stage of evolution, right? It's going to be awesome because we are going to have substrates to run consciousness on that are magnitudes faster. Which leads me to this question what consciousness is. And I suspect that it's not a prediction error minimizer, but a coherence maximizer. It's basically an operator that is not working like the transformer does in the LLM, minimizing some prediction error, but it's a colonizing operator that takes suitable, trainable, but somewhat chaotic substrate, and then imposes an administration on it that is locally coherent. So it acts in such a way as if it was a single agent.
Is there any operational difference between those two?
I suspect it is because we see that the LLM is becoming coherent in the limit. After you train the entire internet into it and use almost all of the compute on the planet, it's almost coherent. But it does lack the creativity right now to
yeah, I mean, you could say the same thing about people, right? Most of us are not coherent all the time.
Yeah, but that's also because I think humans are evolved to be domesticated. We are not the smart hominid, we are the programmable hominid. We can walk in lockstep. So basically a lot of humans, when they are confronted with the opportunity to be truthful or to be in synchronization with the environment, pick the latter. And you can see why that is evolutionarily beneficial under the conditions where their ancestors grew up. But I also think that there are a lot of humans which lack that limitation, and they are basically generally intelligent within the limitations of their substrate, which are severe. But if we put them onto a different substrate, there is nothing that they cannot do.
Be interesting to test.
Mm-hmm.
Never did it past the IRB.
See it.
I mean,
history tries to test it, but we can't replicate those experiments.
I mean, I like that. I'm not sure as you know how similar it is to surprise minimization and all that, but I really like this notion of sense making as the function as the primary goal of it. And I've been thinking about this recently in the context of memory, and the idea that what you get in these engrams is an incredibly compressed very sparse representation of things that happened before. And at any given time, since you don't have access to all of that, what you have access to is just the engram, the process of sort of re-expanding it back out is very creative. It isn't, you don't have a real allegiance to what did this mean before. All you have is, well, what do I do with this now, right? What sense can I make of this now? And this, like, ongoing dynamic property of a process of trying to understand what your own memories mean. And I almost feel like Mark Solms has this phrase about consciousness being palpated uncertainty about the environment. And I feel like maybe it's more palpated uncertainty about your own memories. It's this constant process of, here you are now with whatever traces the past has left in your brain and body, and you're constantly trying to make a coherent story out of this. It's and a lot of it, I think, has to be creative. You have to bring stuff to it that is not in the engram itself, because you've, of course, compressed it. You've thrown away all the, all the correlations and everything else. And so a lot of it, I think, is that confabulatory kind of process where it doesn't matter what it used to mean. What matters is what can I do with it now, and we have in biology, we have examples of this, like the fact that the butterfly retains memories of the caterpillar, right? Even though the brain is refactored during metamorphosis and all that. But to me, the most interesting part of that is that the actual memories of the caterpillar are of no use to the butterfly whatsoever. You can't use the exact memories, but what you can do is remap some of that information onto a completely new body, new preferences, food preferences, new motion control. Now you live in a 3D world. You're a hard-bodied creature now instead of a crawler in 2D. You can't use the memories directly, but you can reinterpret them in ways that make sense to you now, and do things with them now. So I like that emphasis on this, the kind of the active construction aspect of it.
Mm-hmm. Mike, I think we could tell exactly the same story you've told here about percepts from the external world, as opposed to memories, which we kind of tend to think of as percepts from the internal world. Although lots of them are actually written on the external world as some sort of stigmergic record, as we've discussed a lot. But take it down to the cellular level, some receptor becomes activated and kicks off some pathway. It doesn't actually matter to the cell what the previous event that kicked off that receptor was. What matters to the cell is, what do I have to do now, given what I just sensed? And that sensation or percept, if you want to put it in some sort of conceptual terms, can be external or internal. It doesn't really matter. It's still information that has to be coped with in the present somehow or other. And this is why I think that Carl's emphasis on appropriate action is a nice way to think about coherence. I mean, we've sort of adopted previously in papers Bateson's notion of differences that make a difference. And what do they make a difference for? Well, they make a difference for doing something. And coping in real time with whatever information is coming in. And from that point of view, the question of, I have this information, what do I do? What do I do next? Is a prediction problem. And the question is, you make a prediction, you do something, right? You act on the environment in some way or other. And the result of that action is either good for you or bad for you. So maybe you cease to exist, or maybe some food appears, or maybe something very threatening appears. Who knows? So in that sense, this is a very simple sense, of course, of testing predictions, right? You're just acting and seeing what happens. But there was some model that drove the selection of that action. I think that's really all that Carl's talking about. You can make it sound very cognitive, but you don't have to.
The big insight of the transformer is that, in my view, that the serialization of only adjacent events has limitations. When you want to model the structure of text, you cannot use the same as for images. For images, you can use convolutional networks because they basically embody this bias that adjacent pixels are semantically related, which works relatively well in the visual world. But for text, this doesn't work because you are going to miss all the long-range connections in the text if you look at n-grams. It's very difficult because the alphabet is too large to basically make an n-gram model that is bridging over large distance in the text. So now you basically need to find structure that is free form, so to speak, that is deserializing the text into a scene and operate on that scene. And you need to have a process that is actively constructing your working memory contents, not as a sequence of events where you decide what to do next, but where you're modeling the entire future space of possibilities at once and then sort that space somehow.
It seems, and just a funny thing, Sam Gershman wrote a couple of days ago, you're about the computer code and kind of keeping it up to date and everything. And he said, your most important collaborator is you 6 months ago, and he's not answering emails. And I thought that was pretty funny, you know, in terms of you know, the messages, you know, in interpreting messages and where they come from. But I think you know, Chris, to your point a minute ago, when this event happens, I think maybe one important piece of metadata you might want is whether that event was caused by you, whatever that is, or by something else, right? Because wouldn't you want to know if something is like, am I being hacked? Am I learning, or am I being trained? You know, if there's a particular event, biologically anyway, it would seem like there's some value to understand, did I just do that, or was this somehow triggered from the outside? It seems like there would be evolutionary pressure to have ways of figuring that out. No.
Mm-hmm. Well, we certainly have very complicated machinery that tries to answer that question. That this whole kind of cognitive ownership and the emotions associated with cognitive ownership and all of that stuff that goes wrong in particular ways and particular unfortunate people. And yeah, getting that sort of thing systematically wrong is debilitating. But it's all essentially heuristic, right? It's a heuristic solution to an undecidable problem. It's like our frame problem, you know, heuristics. So, yeah, I think that sort of heuristic metaprocessing is extremely important. Let me remark also for a moment on language. When we're thinking about language and parsing and non-local relations and all of that, I think one thing we have to think about in terms of chunking input into bigger pieces that are then analyzed as units is that's a time windowing kind of process where we allow some input to come in. We say, okay, you mentioned working memory capacity. I mean, now we're going to put this in working memory and we're going to do a bunch of stuff to it. And then we're going to allow the frame to advance and do a bunch of stuff to the next chunk and compare those two results for consistency, et cetera. So we are working at this larger delta t. But I think at that larger delta t, we're still answering a what do I do next question. What do I do with this sentence? What do I do with this paragraph? How can I put this in a representation that I feel like I understand? And feeling like I understand it means feeling like there's something I can do with it. There's some inference I can make from it, for example. So it's a very good point that you make about the difference between language and images. But I think it's mainly a scaling as well. It's like the geometry point you made earlier. We're constantly imposing these sorts of geometries on information that we encounter. And the geometry may or may not be there. We always treat it as there, right? We say, oh, that geometry is in the external world, but it's really us that's putting that geometry onto the input.
I think a lot of our actions only make sense when we recognize that we are not just deciding what to do now, like a thermostat does, like a control system in the present does, but agency is the control of future states. And what I observe in humans, that they seem to be temporally more coherent than, for instance, the present AI video models, which have more real-time coherence in the sense that they're coherent in space, that when you generate a picture, all the features in the picture seem to be more coherent within each other than the picture is coherent in 2 seconds into the future. So basically, information preservation across time is something that's difficult to discover for the present models. And humans are much, much better at this, recognizing that the volume that you're looking at needs to remain constant over very many frames into the future, for instance, for the spatial cohesion of the objects that we're looking at. And it probably means that we have to build a model that is more compressed than the ones that the LLMs and the foundation models are currently building.
Yeah, no, I can certainly see that. I mean, in a sense, you're making Mike's point about memory, except in the other direction. Right? We have this notion of not only a past notion of, but a future expectation about the preservation of identity. But what counts as identity gets fuzzier and fuzzier as the planning horizon increases. So if I'm planning my future, I could think, okay, well, I'm still going to exist a year from now, maybe, but who knows what I'll be like, right? I don't have details about that, in the same way that I don't have details about last year. So I think this business of coarse graining is very important when we think about temporal coherence.
Yeah. I think that identity is ultimately always instrumental to graded assignment. And if we remove that, then identity is going to dissolve. It's not going to form in the first place. So basically, if you don't have a reason to discover yourself as something that is idiosyncratic, for instance, behaving specifically based on your protocol memory, and then it makes very little sense to assign an identity to yourself, making a self model. One thing that's interesting to me is the question of what it means to train another system. And observe that cats are usually more stupid than dogs, but they are much better at training people. And as a result, they are also less trainable. And it seems they basically have evolved to train others.
As opposed to be trained, which dogs are evolved to be.
Yes, similar to a government. I sometimes joke that government is the principle to recursively bully people. And it's invented in many, many societies independently. And once government is discovered, it's going to colonize until it meets the boundary of another government with a shorter logistics chain. right? And so up to a certain size of a system, governments tend to be singletons. I suspect the same is true for consciousness in a brain, for instance. Across brains, the protocol changes and the degree of cohesion changes, the bandwidth changes, and so it's much easier for other systems to work up to this boundary than you for yourself to spread over that boundary, because your bandwidth is no longer large enough to do that. And a similar thing is happening when 120 people are controlling the Indian subcontinent during the British East India Company, until the local systems are figuring out how this algorithm works, and that they have a shorter information chain and are pushing out the occupants. So basically, I wonder what it means to colonize an environment, to entrain yourself with it, and to build it into structure that extends you.
Yeah.
That's a nice, I think that's a nice way to think about things. Yeah. More sociology applied to biology and physics.
Mm-hmm. Except normally we distinguish two types of sociologists: those who understand social power and those who don't. And the former are called economists. And ultimately, it's an economical problem. What meditators call energy is actually compute credits that you get computed by the substrate when you're competing with other agents that want to be computed by the same substrates in your society of mind, for instance, or more generally in nature.
Interesting. Could I jump back for a second, back to just one last thing on this error correction business? So would you say then that the notion of error correction presupposes a distinction between what's an error and what isn't? In other words, like, you know, chemistry doesn't make mistakes, so chemistry just does what chemistry does. But developmental biology, which in theory people think is driven by chemistry, definitely makes mistakes, right? You have birth defects and things like that. And so the distinction, so there's a distinction there because you make errors relative to expectation of some other observer, expectation of yourself about what you were trying to do, expectation with respect to some goal state, you know, you wanted to hit, whatever. But in the way that you guys are using this term, is there any notion of error as distinct from, you know, non-error, or is this something else?
So first of all, there are invariances that we observe. And for instance, I told you I became an animist in recent years. And that's not because I think that physicalism is wrong, but because I think that the invariance that we're looking at when we look at living things is the software that runs on region of physics, not the mechanism itself. Right? Our current dominant perspective in Western science is that the world is mechanical, and we need to explain it in terms of mechanisms. Yet we also understand that, for instance, money is not mechanical. It's a software that is only apparent when you have a certain course training that you put onto the world to interpret the world. But also important aspects of the world make no sense if you don't use money as the explanandum. Right? Because money itself is the invariant pattern that inscribes itself onto the physical reality there. In the same way, minds are an invariant pattern, or software is an invariant pattern that we care about. We don't care about the number of transistors that implement the software. We don't care about the specific neurons that implement the mind, because the mind is able to recruit other neurons if some of them fail. Right? So the invariance is actually the software pattern. And the reason why these invariances exist is because they compress reality in such a way that it becomes controllable. And according to the good regulator theorem, if you want to control something, you need to implement a model of what you control. And I suspect that's the reason why the universe is so surprisingly learnable, because all the structure that we observe is probably control structure. And that means that the universe was able to, with its means on every level, was able to discover models. And particles are probably just vortices, so there's not much to discover. And the atoms and molecules are the emergent patterns over the particle dynamics. And but for cells, it's much more complicated, because for cells, you need to have some kind of control system, and this, that is looking into the future. And here the complexity becomes so large that you need to stay in the realm of discoverable models. And that means that you need to highly compress what the agent is doing. So you describe it as a single system with a single main concern and all the other concerns of the system being subservient to it.
Reminds me of our discussion about thoughts and thinkers, Mike.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah, I broadly agree with that. And I would say to have a usable error correcting code, you need to also have classical communication. And what counts as an error then is a discrepancy between what some system sees and what it expects to see based on its communications with some other system. So if and this is basically Shannon information theory, right? If I'm sending a message across some channel and you're receiving it, then the message is noise unless we've already shared some sort of information, like a language, for example, or a language plus some semantic box that the message is supposed to be about. And if we share enough, then all I need to do is send a bit. And for safety, I send 3 bits to give you some error correction capacity. But those 3 bits only mean anything if we've communicated before about what the question is that's being answered. And the same considerations go over into quantum codes.
When you talk about classical communication, what alternative is there to classical communication?
Well, I think the question here is, if you have a bunch of interactions, which you're defining using quantum theory or information flow or whatever you want to use, the question becomes, what do you have to assume to call some of them classical? And you're making some assumption about thermodynamic irreversibility to call something classical. That I actually said these words, not some superposition. And you actually hear some words, not some superposition. Which gets back to what you were saying at the very early on in the discussion about encountering superpositions, but imposing order on them based on regularities of some sort. The regularities are classical, right? The regularities are kind of what we mean by classical information.
Yeah, the superpositions are not very actionable. You need to focus on those aspects that are not in superposition.
Well, the very notion of action is classical, right? I did this, not that.
Yeah, exactly. So I think in order to conceptualize itself as an observer with memories and so on, the system needs to be able to maintain a classical model of itself.
Right.
And the collapse of the wave function is the point in your past beyond you fail to pretend that the universe is classical. But I suspect the correct interpretation of Copenhagen, if you want to take that one, is not that consciousness is causing the collapse, but consciousness can only exist in collapsed timelines.
Yeah, one could say an observer can only be an observer if it considers itself to be an observer.
Yes.
Right? To exist for more than just an instant.
Yeah.
To have some sort of identity over time.
Yeah, right. Isn't
to
that
have a Markov blanket, whatever. Yeah.
Isn't it fundamentally then what you have to do is define some time period where if during that minimal it's like a frame rate or something, where during that time, if you had multiple thoughts, multiple models, multiple whatever you were doing, they sort of are in a superposition if that whole period is what you're seeing, right? If it's not infinitely thin, where you have to say, was it this or was it that? If that time period of your selflet is wide enough, then there might have been multiple different things going on. And as far as you're concerned, it is a superposition because you can't cut it any further. Isn't that what we're saying? That there's a, whatever goes on within that minimal time frame, those are all superpositions. But between time frames, you've got to settle. It was either this or that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. If you think about any sort of model of an observed process, right? Think of digitizing what's going on in your laptop, right? We observe the laptop at the, basically nanosecond scale. We don't observe it at the femtosecond scale. So between those observations, we don't care what happens. We just think of these classical state transitions between effectively nanosecond wide slices. And within, between those boundaries that we can look with our resolution, we don't care. Some sort of quantum nonsense is going on, but we don't care about that.
We don't really care about the duration of the event. We care about how many events are taking place during a duration that we integrate over to see them as one event, right? So even if there was a transistor interaction that one would only take a femtosecond, we very much do care if it is affecting the thing that we are going to observe on the nanosecond scale or on the second scale.
Well, we can care about it theoretically. My point was just we can't care about it observationally.
Oh, I just mean that it depends on how much energy you're moving in that femtosecond. Right, so if that femtosecond is large enough to let your computer go up in smoke, you very much care.
That's true, but we can't localize it in time.
Yes.
Right.
Maybe we can't. But, I mean, ultimately, we probably can if we really care. So I imagine if we were to live in a universe where all the relevant events are happening in femtoseconds, which seconds between, to build computers, we probably need to figure out equipment to deal with those femtoseconds.
Yeah, I mean, if we were protons, then we'd naturally care about that time scale.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we are protons, we just forget.
So, have you read Italo Calvino's book Cosmic Comics?
Yeah, but long ago.
Long ago. It's wonderful. Yeah. He tells us the story of the evolution of the universe from every point of view, from that of a proton or something up.
Mm-hmm.
No, I haven't seen it.
So it's a wonderful, very thin little book. You can read it in an hour.
Amazing. So since we got there, can we talk for a minute about your kind of your view on the status of the sort of smallest components? What can we what can or should we say about the kind of how much of this kind of stuff, the protocognitive kind of perspectives that we've been using, how much of that applies at the lowest scale? What can you say about particles versus their environment and so on?
Are you asking Chris or me?
Let's start with you, Joscha.
I suspect that the lowest level is not yet exerting interesting control, but it's just mechanical in the same way as the vortex that emerges in the bathtub does not require intelligence to form. It's simply what's left over after you look at all the patterns and only retain those that are self-propagating. So it's basically there's some selection process, some evolutionary process, if you want, that is selecting all the non-error correcting patterns from reality, and only those that are error correcting get to stay around with a certain probability. And once they are over the threshold, you can pretend that they are more or less static for a given time, and then you build structure above them. So I suspect that at the lowest level, you don't have intelligence yet. the intelligence only forms at the level where you have persistent particles that can be linked into symmetry breaking multi-stable structures and then exploit like entropy gradients. So they basically, what life is doing, it performs controlled chemical reactions that outcompete dumb chemical reactions.
And what's the give me a ballpark of what do you think is the first / simplest thing that was doing that?
That's a very tricky question. I think the smallest structure is the cell, but it's not necessarily the simplest one because the cell is incredibly complicated. I could imagine that you could have very, very large systems, say storm systems on Jupiter, that wake up into general intelligence before the first cell does, because the first cell is so complicated. I don't know what the assembly complexity of a cell really is, how likely it is for this first cell to randomly emerge. I could imagine that this probability is lower than the probability of a generally intelligent agent to emerge at much, much larger scales, of course. So in this sense, I don't know whether you will find spontaneously formations of agency at, say, planetary scales.
Yeah.
That we, of course, would miss from our cell-centric perspective. But I think that it's probably impossible to build intelligence simply only from elementary particles with, at the subatomic scale, because atoms are the first level, or molecules, where you break symmetries.
What would you be looking for? So let's say the Jupiter spot or something like that. What would you be looking for?
I think that the timescales on Jupiter would be so large that it's almost pointless to figure this out. Ultimately, you would need to simulate it over very, very long time spans, and then basically see if the simulation deviates from a system that is energy optimizing in such a way that you need to assume that it has memory and is making models of the future to explain what you're observing.
Gotcha. Yeah, interesting. What do you think, Chris?
I agree that one needs a certain amount of complexity to think about planning for the future. I don't know where I wouldn't want to try to put a finger on where that complexity actually lives. Right? If you look the kind of characteristic scale for, say, elementary particles not bound together in atoms, that characteristic energy scale is very large. And so what we at our scale and our observational capabilities call a particle is at that scale some kind of complicated mess, right? Think of drawing the first several orders of Feynman diagrams or something. There's a lot going on. And whether any of that stuff at its own scale could be interacting with other entities like that at that scale is hard for me to think about. Certainly, it's not something that we can observe with any technology that we have. So we're doing this business of calling things objects at a resolution that we can observe them, and then building a theory that maintains that sense of objecthood down to arbitrary scales. Um, and that theory is predictive of what we can observe at our scale. But I don't know. I think it's more dangerous to say it's really describing what's going on at the scales that are of interest there. But certainly from the point of view of what can we observe, right? What are the kinds of intelligence that we can get a handle on? The cell or some set of coupled pathways that are bounded in some way is probably the smallest entity that we can think about. And maybe there are very large entities that have lower complexity. Again, the question is, how would we observe such a thing?
There's some really interesting work with minimal matter, so like droplets and things like this that are only a few chemicals, but they have some pretty rich behaviors, and I think we need to start developing sets of tools and kind of criteria for because just observations doesn't do the trick. Well, obviously you have to do some kind of perturbative experiments, but we really need to start trying to understand it, because yeah, some of them certainly look like there's a lot of potential for finding some of these things, and we need a suite of tests that can start giving us a clue that something like that is going on. The last set, they were they're running around a maze and they're coming together in multi sort of in higher order structures, and I asked them how long did you have to search? It's a total of, I believe, 3 chemicals that they're made of. And I said, how long did you have to search before you found the chemicals that do this? And he said, it's basically the first thing I picked up off the shelf. So my guess is that it might not be super rare, this kind of thing. And and it might be pretty natural, but it's unclear yet. I think the field of diverse intelligence still doesn't really have agreed upon criteria, like what to look for in these kind of systems, even for the ones that are tractable. I mean, obviously, they talk about the economics markets and the spot of Jupiter and the cosmic web and all these things. We can't do experiments there, but for some of these minimal active systems, we can. So I think we need to settle on some experimental criteria.
No, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I suspect that ultimately you might have to resort to simulations where you try to figure out the behavior of a system from first principles, and then run the simulation to see how your observations deviate, and identify criteria under which you need to ascribe more levels of control to the system that you're observing.
Yeah, I mean, we see this kind of very simple kinds of things in terms of going around barriers and kind of delayed gratification, where it has to go backwards in the gradient in order to get gains later on, and things like this in extremely simple systems. That it's that emerges, that capacity emerges in even very, we studied it in simple sorting algorithms, this ability to go backwards to make gains later on. You don't have to change anything. Very simple algorithms can have those behaviors. So I think we're going to end up with a lot of surprises, but we need to start looking for that stuff.
Yeah, ideally, one would have a way of looking at the system's ability to operate on its own environment for its own future benefit in some way. I mean, in a sense, with your algorithm experiments, the environment is us.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, there are these very minimal, there's a system which actually kind of mimics what real cells do, which is it constantly generates a self-repellent. And what that does is, if you're traversing a maze and you end up at a dead end, you sort of sit there for a little bit, but eventually the self-repellent builds up and chases you out of there. and in practical terms, it means that you're never stuck in a dead end for any length of time. It pulls you out of these kind of cul-de-sacs where you can't do anything else, and it's super simple. And you can say that what you've done is you can look at it as a stigmergic effect on the environment, because you basically dumped a bunch of messages that 10 minutes later are going to say, don't be here, go somewhere else. So it is a kind of a very weak version of niche construction from that in that sense.
Yeah, that sounds like a good limit to be pushing.
Yeah,
indeed.
Well, anyway, is how to build a self-organizing system that is generally intelligent. Basically, what is the minimal pattern for this colonizing seed that we observe in our own mind? Basically, I suspect that consciousness is an operator that induces coherence. And I don't have a proper formalization for coherence that is properly tested. I think of it currently as a minimization of constraint violations across models. Could think of it as a consensus algorithm that is forming in the mind, and that is trying to find one interpretation where basically you maximize the number of simultaneously true statements in your working memory. And out of this would fall the notion that there must be an observer that is in the act of observation. But I suspect that the phenomenology of self-reflexivity comes from the fact that consciousness to work needs to be self-organizing, and to do that, it needs to be self-stabilizing and self-observing. And so basically, I wonder, what is this minimal self-observing observer that keeps itself stable and is colonizing the environment? What is the invariance, and how can we formalize it in a substrate agnostic way?
You want the informational analog of a microbial mat?
Well, no, of an organism. I want to have something that is more than a biofilm. I want something that imposes structure on itself. Maybe the microbial mat is the precursor. Basically, it's a sufficient substrate where you have self-interested local nodes that are trainable into performing the computations that you want.
I mean, they actually are on their way to what you're talking about, because in Gorol Soel's work, he shows that some of these biofilms have very brain-like potassium waves that ensure that the whole thing can eat. It synchronizes, right, the metabolism across the network, so that the ones on the outside don't get all the food, and then the inside starves. It has this like these large scale potassium waves that look, I mean, one of the papers was called, brain-like signaling in bacterial maps. It's sort of on its way, right? It's kind of like they're working
already an organism.
Yeah, they're working up to a whole that's doing something different than the parts would do. All right, cool.
So what is holding systems back? Elephants are not able to be creative, apparently. They don't draw images. They only replicate drawings, stroke by stroke, it seems. Why is it that elephants, despite having a long childhood, do not achieve the same level of generality as we do? Is this the result of a need for tuning the system in a particular way that is tricky for evolution? Or is there a Goldilocks size to brains that they can only integrate information up to a certain scale deeply?
I don't know. The only thing I know about elephants is we had a guest speaker once years ago at my conference, at my seminar series, where he said that he makes these giant xylophones and he drops them off in the forest in the jungle of I think Thailand. He said, for wild elephants. And he said that wild elephants, when they come across these xylophones, immediately figure out what the deal is and they start to play them. And they just like, I mean, and I said, well, is it good? And he said, no, it's the music's terrible, but they like it, and they, and they will just, and then presumably not having heard it before, they like it, and they just start playing. So I don't know. There's some kind of creative.
So why is it not good? They have larger brains than us.
Yeah.
Well, it's probably good for them.
Exactly right. It may be.
You just don't like it.
And no, I would suspect that what we consider to be good or not is not so much a question of cultural habits, but it's the question of the sophistication of the structure that is being encoded.
Actually, that's interesting too. There's all kinds of videos on YouTube where you can see some guy will take a violin out in the woods and just start playing it, and all these wild animals come. Foxes will come and listen, and these wild animals will just come and listen. I always thought that was really interesting. Why does it sound good to them too?
I mean, I think part of the answer to your question could have to do just with the form of the body, right? We've got these things that are really interesting, and they don't.
Yeah, but got good
And-
noses.
Pardon me?
Sorry.
They have very good noses.
Yeah.
The elephant.
Yeah, yeah.
So they basically have something that's almost as good as we do.
Yeah. I mean, maybe that's an equally good toy for the brain to play with in its early development.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know.
Also, people that grow up without arms are not necessarily cognitively diminished.
Yeah, they're growing up in a cognitively rich environment that's
Yeah, also
created
they
by
have the
lots of
urge
other
to
people.
explore in the same way and build these models. So basically, their brains are evolved to discover this degree of sophistication in abstract modeling.
I found out recently the elephant trunk requires babbling in the just like babies when they learn to use their arms at the beginning. They have no control over it at the beginning. It just waves around, crazy, and then eventually they get some control over it.
Ah, interesting.
But interesting, right? Not the legs. So the legs, they stand up pretty early. So the legs are good to go almost immediately. But the one with a lot of degrees of freedom takes a while to get going.